June 4, 1994. Federal Medical Center, Rochester, Minnesota. A 66-year-old man with one eye, his body wasted to under 100 pounds, took his last breath in a prison hospital bed. The movie gives you Mark Wahlberg. History gives you something far colder. Gregory Scarpa Sr. was born May 8, 1928, in Bensonhurst, Brooklyn, to Italian immigrant parents. And from the outside, for most of his life, he looked like a neighborhood man. He coached kids. He cooked Sunday sauce. His daughters called him Daddy. His neighbors called him Greg. He was quiet. He didn't drink. He didn't brag. He didn't need to, because the street already knew. By his early 20s, Scarpa had drifted into the orbit of what would become the Colombo crime family, one of New York's original 5 families, formally recognized at the 1957 Appalachian Commission meeting that the FBI itself used as the founding proof that a national organized crime syndicate existed in America. Scarpa didn't rise through that world by being loud. He rose by being effective, clean, surgical. By his late 30s, he had become the chief enforcer for boss Carmine Persico, a man the courts would eventually sentence to 139 years in federal prison, and he was running the full portfolio out of a Brooklyn social club called the Wimpy Boys. Loan sharking, hijacking, securities fraud, contract killing, all of it, simultaneously, out of the same room. What separated Scarpa from the career criminals the FBI regularly prosecuted wasn't violence alone. The New York mob had no shortage of violent men. What separated him was the psychology underneath it. No remorse, no hesitation, no loose ends. Investigators who later reconstructed his movements described a man who approached murder the way a tradesman approaches a job. You go in, you do the work, you leave. He reportedly said of one victim that he'd like to dig him up and shoot him again. That wasn't anger. That was something colder than anger. Federal investigators would ultimately link him to at least 26 murders. Some researchers and prosecutors who studied the Colombo files believe the true number is significantly higher. The 1992 Colombo War prosecutions, detailed in United States v. Orena and related RICO proceedings in the Eastern District of New York, paint a portrait of a man who was, by any clinical measure, one of the most prolific killers in the history of American organized crime. And every single one of those years, the FBI knew exactly who he was. That is where this story stops being about one man and starts being about a system. March 1962. Gregory Scarpa walks into a federal arrest and walks out of it, having made a deal that would quietly reshape the next 30 years of American law enforcement history. The charge was armed robbery. He was looking at serious federal time, and the FBI, which had been watching the Colombo family for years without getting deep enough inside to matter, saw an opportunity. They approached him. The offer was structured around what the Bureau called its top echelon informant program, a classification created directly out of J. Edgar Hoover's obsession with dismantling La Cosa Nostra after the 1957 Appalachian raid had humiliated the Bureau by proving the mob existed at a national scale, while the FBI had been looking the other way for decades. Top echelon status wasn't offered to street-level criminals. It was reserved for insiders, men who sat in rooms where decisions were made, men who knew names, ranks, financial structures, planned hits, and chain of command. Scarpa qualified on every count. He said yes, and the moment he did, the FBI made a calculation that would haunt the Bureau for generations. They decided that what Scarpa could give them was worth more than what they would have to ignore to keep him giving it. That calculation was not unique to Scarpa. Across the same era, the FBI was running similar arrangements with figures like Gregory's own boss Carmine Persico's associates, and with informants embedded in other families. But few of those relationships ran as long, as deep, or as lethally unmonitored as this one. The Bureau's own internal guidelines, codified in what became the Attorney General's Bond Guidelines on FBI use of informants, guidelines that were repeatedly revised throughout the PEL. 1970s and 1980s, precisely because of cases like Scarpa, required handlers to document criminal activity report it up the chain, and seek authorization before allowing an asset to continue operating. The evidence that emerged from later court proceedings in the Eastern District of New York strongly suggests those guidelines were not followed, not consistently, not honestly. In 1985, when Scarpa faced federal indictment on a major credit card fraud operation that should have sent him to prison, his handler Lynn DeVecchio submitted a memo to the sentencing judge. Scarpa received 5 years probation and a $10,000 fine. His own mob colleagues couldn't believe it. The FBI had not just recruited a killer, they had begun protecting one. And the worst of it was still years away. Summer of 1964. The American South is a war zone without a declared war. On June 21st, 3 young civil rights workers disappeared into the Mississippi night. James Chaney, 21 years old, a black activist from Meridian. Andrew Goodman, 20, a Jewish college student from Manhattan. Michael Schwerner, 24, also a Jewish New Yorker. They had come to Neshoba County as part of Freedom Summer, a coordinated voter registration campaign that the Ku Klux Klan, working in direct collaboration with local law enforcement, had decided to answer with murder. They were pulled over on a rural road, handed to Klan members, driven to a remote location, and executed. Then they vanished into the Mississippi earth. J. Edgar Hoover dispatched scores of agents. The investigation went nowhere. Local police departments were riddled with Klansmen. Witnesses who knew anything were living under the constant threat of death. The Bureau had no informants inside the Mississippi Klan, no leverage, and no leads that held. They knew with reasonable certainty who was responsible. They could not prove it. They could not even find the bodies. And so, according to testimony delivered by Linda Shiro in 2007 federal proceedings, the FBI flew a Brooklyn mob hitman to Mississippi, handed him a gun and a bag of cash in a hotel room, and pointed him at a Klansman. Shiro stated that Scarpa later told her he kidnapped the man, forced a gun into his mouth, and extracted the location of the bodies. The 3 civil rights workers were found on August 4, 1964, buried inside an earthen dam on the Jolly Farm outside Philadelphia, Mississippi, 44 days after they vanished. Each had been shot. The federal prosecution that followed in 1967 convicted 7 men, resting its case largely on 2 Klan insiders who turned witness. The Bureau has never officially confirmed Scarpa's role. Several former FBI agents dispute it entirely, pointing instead to a paid Mississippi source, a state highway patrolman, as the real break in the case. Then January 10, 1966. Civil rights leader Vernon Dahmer was firebombed in his own home near Hattiesburg by Klan Imperial Wizard Sam Bowers. Dahmer grabbed a shotgun and stood at his burning front door, trading fire with the Klansmen while his family escaped out the back. He inhaled the flames. He died that day. Bowers wasn't convicted of his murder until 1998, 32 years later. The FBI had no leads again. And by multiple documented accounts, Scarpa came back south a second time. A Klansman named Lawrence Byrd was beaten so severely he signed a 22-page statement implicating his own. The United States government, unable to defeat domestic white supremacist terror through legal means, had allegedly contracted the violent part of the work to organized crime. Vernon Dahmer stood at his burning door so his children could live. Gregory Scarpa was the instrument the government allegedly used when the law wasn't enough. Scarpa went quiet for a while. Dropped from the formal informant roles in the mid-1960s, he kept killing in Brooklyn without federal cover. Then, in 1980, the FBI brought him back in. And this time, they gave him a handler who would become the most controversial figure in the entire history of the Bureau's relationship with organized crime. Supervisory Special Agent R. Lindley DeVecchio, a decorated FBI veteran who had joined the Bureau under J. Edgar Hoover himself. A man who ran the Colombo Squad in the FBI's New York field office and who built his entire career, reputation on the intelligence his prized personal asset kept delivering. DeVecchio reopened Scarpa under the Bureau's top echelon program, and the 2 men developed a relationship that went so far beyond the boundaries of professional handler and asset that it stopped resembling law enforcement almost entirely. They met alone, not in field offices, in FBI-rented apartments, in hotel rooms, away from supervisors, away from documentation, away from oversight. Scarpa, in recorded conversations with associates, referred to DeVecchio in code as his girlfriend. That detail is not colorful mob trivia. It is a direct window into how thoroughly the professional wall between federal agent and organized crime figure had dissolved. Throughout the 1980s, while DeVecchio was officially running Scarpa as an intelligence source mapping the Colombo hierarchy, Scarpa never stopped operating as a criminal. Loan sharking, hijacking, a major credit card fraud network that, when it finally surfaced in a federal indictment, should have ended his freedom permanently. Instead, DeVecchio submitted a sentencing memo to the judge. Scarpa walked with probation. His own mob colleagues, men who had spent their lives reading the signals of who was protected and who wasn't, started quietly wondering if the Grim Reaper was a rat. Then came 1991, and the Third Colombo War. Boss Carmine Persico was in federal prison, serving what amounted to a life sentence. Acting boss Victor Orena moved to seize permanent control of the family. The Colombo organization fractured violently down the middle. Scarpa aligned with Persico, and what followed, documented extensively in United States v. Orena and United States v. Persico in the Eastern District of New York, was one of the bloodiest internal mob conflicts since the Gallo-Profaci War of the early 1960s. Roughly a dozen men died. Neighborhoods in Brooklyn lived under the shadow of random gunfire. Innocent bystanders were caught in the crossfire. Scarpa, 63 years old, HIV positive, riddled with cancer, was the single most violent participant in the entire war. He gunned down Vincent Fusaro as Fusaro hung Christmas lights outside his Brooklyn home in December 1991. He killed Nicholas Grancio on January 7, 1992. He murdered Lorenzo Lampassi on May 22, 1992. He was not slowing down. He was accelerating. And then fellow FBI agent Christopher Favo filed an internal complaint that detonated what remained of DeVecchio's career. Favo alleged that DeVecchio had been feeding Scarpa live intelligence during the war, names, locations, photographs of rival faction members, that the supervisor of the FBI's as Colombo Squad had effectively been running operational support for one side of a mob war. Favo stated that when news of a rival's murder reached the office, DeVecchio slapped his desk and said, in words that have since appeared in court filings, congressional testimony, and investigative journalism, words to the effect of, "We're going to win this thing," as if the war belonged to him too. The FBI's Office of Professional Responsibility investigated. DeVecchio retired in 1996. Brooklyn District Attorney Charles Hines indicted him in 2006 on 4 counts of murder, charging that leaked intelligence had directly led to the deaths of Mary Bari, Joe Brewster D'Amico, Larry Lampassi, and a teenager named Patrick Porco. The case collapsed in 2007 when star witness Linda Shiro was caught on old recordings, contradicting her own prior testimony. DeVecchio was cleared. He has always maintained his innocence. He later published a memoir titled, "We're Going to Win This Thing," taking the very phrase Favo had attributed to him and using it as his title. But cleared in a courtroom and clean in history are not the same thing. The FBI had built its most celebrated organized crime operation on the back of a man it could not control, handled by an agent it could not trust, producing intelligence it could not cleanly use, while bodies accumulated in Brooklyn that it could not honestly explain. The system didn't just fail. The system may have pulled the trigger. By the time 1992 closed out, Gregory Scarpa Sr. had one eye, a death sentence growing inside his bloodstream, and a bullet wound still fresh in his face. He was not supposed to still be standing. And yet there he was. The HIV had entered his body 6 years earlier in the most darkly fitting way imaginable. In 1986, Scarpa had needed emergency surgery and a blood transfusion. By mob instinct, by the deep tribal distrust of institutions that had defined his entire life, he refused the hospital blood bank. He asked people he knew to donate instead. Among the roughly 15 to 20 donors who came forward was a man named Paul Mele, a bodybuilder who used anabolic steroids and shared needles and who carried HIV without knowing that the virus passed into Scarpa's bloodstream that day. He later sued the hospital for negligence and won a civil settlement, but the virus stayed, and it was already winning. On December 29, 1992, out on bail and under house arrest, Scarpa got into a street-level gunfight with drug dealers in his own Brooklyn neighborhood. He killed one of them. He took a bullet directly to the face that destroyed his left eye. From that point forward, photographs of Scarpa show a man behind dark glasses, the last physical marker of a life that had finally begun collapsing faster than he could hold it together. On May 6, 1993, before federal judge Jack B. Weinstein in the Eastern District of New York, Gregory Scarpa Sr. pleaded guilty to 3 murders and a murder conspiracy. Judge Weinstein, one of the most respected and intellectually rigorous federal jurists in American history, sentenced him to 10 years. Scarpa, by then so physically deteriorated that the courtroom itself seemed too large for what remained of him, served barely 1 year of that sentence. He died on June 4, 1994, at the Federal Medical Center in Rochester, Minnesota, weighing under 100 pounds. The official cause was AIDS-related complications. He was 66 years old. And what did 30 years of that relationship with the FBI ultimately produce? Carmine Persico, the boss Scarpa had served and killed for, died in federal prison in 2019, still under a 139-year sentence handed down in the 1986 Commission case, one of the most significant RICO prosecutions in American history. Lynn DeVecchio retired, wrote his book, and died a free man. Sam Bowers, the Klan Imperial Wizard, whose order killed Vernon Dahmer, finally went to prison in 1998 and died there in 2006. The institution that had run Scarpa for decades, the FBI, has never officially confirmed he was ever in Mississippi at all. Not in 1964, not in 1966, not once. By any means will give audiences a thriller. A mafia killer who does something that resembles good. A partnership across racial lines that carries the satisfying weight of moral progress. Mark Wahlberg will be compelling. The cinematography will be striking. The arc will feel earned. That is what cinema does. It shapes the unbearable into something an audience can sit with for 2 hours and leave feeling something clean. But the real story does not end clean. The real story ends with a federal agency that paid a murderer for decades, intervened in his sentencing, potentially fed him intelligence during a mob war, and then watched him die in a prison hospital bed and quietly closed the file. It ends with a Brooklyn neighborhood that buried men whose names never made the newspapers because the government that should have stopped the killing had a financial and operational interest in the man doing it. Vernon Dahmer stood at the door of his burning house with a shotgun so his children could run. He died for the right of Black Americans to vote. His name deserves to be spoken clearly and without the shadow of the man the government allegedly used to avenge him. Gregory Scarpa was the weapon. The FBI was the hand. And the truth, 60 years later, is still classified, still disputed, and still buried somewhere just out of reach. Just like those 3 young men were in that Mississippi earthen dam for 44 days in the summer of 1964. There is a version of this story that ends neatly. The government used a bad man to catch worse men. Civil rights workers got justice. The mob got prosecuted. The system, however imperfect, worked. That version exists, and it is not entirely wrong, but it is not entirely honest either. What the full record shows, across decades of court filings, RICO prosecutions, congressional scrutiny, investigative journalism, and the testimonies of men and women who lived inside this world, is something far more unsettling. It shows an institution that made a decision in 1962 that it never fully reckoned with. The FBI did not stumble into Gregory Scarpa. They recruited him. They classified him. They paid him. They protected him in open court. And when the weight of what that relationship had produced finally became too heavy to carry, quietly, they let a star witness collapse on the stand and closed the file. The men Scarpa killed in Brooklyn during 30 years of protected operation did not get a congressional hearing. Their families did not get a settlement. Their names did not make it into the press releases the Bureau issued when it announced its Colombo family indictments. They were the cost the FBI decided was acceptable. That calculation was made by human beings sitting in offices in Lower Manhattan, and it was made deliberately. Vernon Dahmer voted with his life. James Chaney, Andrew Goodman, and Michael Schwerner died for the idea that American democracy belonged to everyone. Those truths stand completely independent of Gregory Scarpa, of Lynn DeVecchio, of Carmine Persico, of every dark transaction that surrounded them. The institutions we trust to protect us are built and run by people. People make calculations. Some of those calculations leave bodies behind. That is not a movie. That is history. And history does not end when the credits roll.